Okay, so we'll go ahead and jump right in. Welcome. We're really glad you're joining us today. I'm Lauren Hurt-Ashwin. I'm the Growth Catalyst at Engage to Learn. We're interviewing our CEO, Shannon Buerk, who has a background in psychology and a wealth of knowledge surrounding this topic. And we are going to jump right in with our interview of Miss Shannon Buerk. Just to get us started, a little bit of background, Shannon, with Engage to Learn, what is your what's our definition of the role of a coach?
Well, I love that question. And I think I would love to see, and I have you guys on grid view so I can actually see hands. How many of you that are joining this session, you either are or have been a coach? And by that, I mean like an instructional coach, obviously. Okay, wow, yay. All right, so we have a lot of people on here that can definitely help answer this question. So I would also love to hear your answers or see your answers at least. So maybe you could add your answer to this question in the chat as well. What do you see as the role of a coach? And I'll start answering it. Two, we have a great resource that I would say it would be our standard answer in terms of from Engage to Learn, and that is a website link, and it's on your idea pad. And maybe Brooke, you can throw that into the chat as well. Since we've basically defined the role of a coach in our coach standards. So those of you that work with us already and have been through Coaches Academy, you've seen those coach standards. If you haven't, or even if you have, you can go to the website and you can actually see all the coach standards in even the timeline, like how those are coached over 9 sessions, like each one of those related to a timeline. So that's kind of the standard answer, I would say. And that includes things like, a collaborative partner in terms of the role of the coach, a collaborative partner, someone that has for sure some technical expertise. In this day and age, it has to be someone that has, digital fluency that can manage platforms, and in the spring and beyond, that's even more important. Someone that knows how to use a really systemic coaching process and those kind of things. So you'll see all those online. But now I'll give you the off the record answer to the role of the coach. And what I'll say about that is, and Lauren mentioned that we're passionate about this topic. I think the role of the coach is, and we say this a lot, it's a lot about kind of your belief system. And so I come from a family that, just to be honest, like we're all fixers. Like we want to fix the situation. Like we hear about a problem and we want to jump in and fix it, And that is not the role of the coach, is what I'll say. The role of the coach is not to fix it. The role of the coach is to help other people discover their own solutions, like the title of this interview is. And I think that is very difficult to balance. And we'll get into that a little bit more, like how to balance it later. But it really comes down to believing that people can discover their own solutions, and that even if I have the right answer, it isn't necessarily the best way to coach someone to tell them the right answer. And I think that is difficult. Like I can fix the problem. I have a lot of years of education now. I have a lot of experience. I've coached, thousands of people. I have researched and written on white papers and books. And so, I have a lot of answers, but I know firmly that just because I know the answer doesn't mean that I'm helping someone by giving them the answer. So the coach, it's more about helping people discover their own solutions and understanding and believing that they will. I've also facilitated a lot of strategic design, and it's funny, like people are like, can you just write us a 5-year plan? And I'm like, well, I could. Yes, I could write you one. It'd be good. It'd be really good. But you would never implement it because it wouldn't be yours, so it doesn't make sense for me to write you one, even if it looks great and you can publish it and go like, woo, and I think it's the same, with a coach. It's like, how do we get to a place that we can help people find their own solution? So that's the role. We say a lot of times in our organization, don't be the resource. If you are the resource, then when you leave, they don't have a resource. So if you are the resource, you are setting them up for failure unless you're there all the time, which you're not. So, you can't be the resource. So love to, again, see anyone else's and everyone else's answers in the chat if you want to answer that great question. And I think it's good in your districts, if you haven't already, to create that coach profile that like really defines what is the role of the coach. And that way coaches are used in the way that, you've defined and been intentional about in a district. Lauren, feel free to add also.
No, that's great. I love that. And there's so, I feel like right now coaches are in such a unique place with the virtual support that they're offering. And I know it's looking very different, all across the state. And I'm just excited to bring up this topic so that we can be reminded, even in the virtual setting, how to do this, and that it's still, at the forefront of our minds. So
let me also just refer y'all, Lauren mentioned this on the idea pad that Buerk put together for us, that we have some resources. So this is a book that's on there, You Already Know How to Be Great, that I think is really very aligned to this, philosophy or type of thinking. It's a performance coaching book, performance-based coaching book, but it just talks about basically like every person has the capacity for greatness. So it's just all about, helping people find their own, potential kind of thing. So that's the philosophy that we're talking about. So that's a good resource that's on your idea pad as well.
I love the definitions that people are putting in the chat as well. Those are great. So, Shannon, thinking about coaching in this setting, can you talk more about how adult learning and motivation would be relevant for coaches to explore further?
Yeah, so one of our coach standards, actually, for those of you that have been working with us, one of our new coach standards is around this idea of adult learning and motivation. And I think it's really, it's true for students too. It's true for learners too, what we're talking about. But absolutely, if you study the research on adult learning and adult motivation, you see, people don't like to be told what to do, right? So adults, and educators, they're professionals. And so, and I don't think that we ever would approach, a conversation or a coaching situation thinking, that they don't have their own good ideas. I think a lot of times it's just us trying to help. But there's two books that I really love. One of them is Switch by Chip and Dan Heath. I love the Heath brothers. Everything they've ever written is amazing. Their latest book, Upstream, is amazing, but that's totally off topic. But Switch is, how to make change when change is hard. And I love this book. It completely changed my thinking about how to really help people make changes. And y'all, if we've ever had to help people through change, it is right now. Supporting educators through change is so important right now. People are getting burned out, leaving the profession, they're exhausted. It's more important than ever to support them through change. And I think Switch has such a great framework for that, with the 3 ways you think about supporting people through change. So it's important to provide, like we talk about it, like Simon Sinek's, like the why, for why you're going to change. And they talk about that from the emotion standpoint. I don't know how many, raise your hand if you're familiar with Switch, if you've ever read it. Okay, so awesome. So, it's kind of broken up into, how you direct the writer, which is, our head, like giving people, ideas and reasons that work well rationally for them. But you also have to, direct the emotion or the heart. Like you have to give some why that appeals to people's emotion as well, because we know that, emotion overrides our rational thinking quite often. So you have to address both of those. I think the third one is maybe the most important, for the third piece of that framework is maybe the most important for coaches. And that's about shaping the path. And I think it's often neglected in our work. We can create systems or actually delete systems or change systems or strategically abandon systems. And just by thinking about our systems, we can make change for educators easier. So I used to always do that when I was in a school district and people would come to me and say, you know, the principals aren't getting it or the teachers aren't getting it. And I'll say, what can we do? What can we do? Let's look at our own systems. What are we doing now that's working? What are we doing that's getting in the way? We're probably making this too complicated. What are we doing that's getting in the way? How can we? So shaping the path is all about what can I do to actually make this easier for people to make the change. And that doesn't mean telling them the answer. That means what systems do we have that are complicating this too much? Or is there systems we can put in place? So Switch is a great one. Dan Pink, of course, I love Drive. Not a huge fan of Dan because, you know, anyway, that's another story. But I like some, you know, his work has been good. His books have been really good. He's not the real deal in person, I'll just say. But anyway, because when I had him in a Q&A, he couldn't answer the questions. I was like, come on, dude. But anyway, but his books are really good. And Drive is based on some research about human motivation that I think is really important for us to remember. And it's not like, you know, in education, everybody always talks about, oh, we need to be making more money. Well, if you look at the research, that actually wouldn't be necessarily more motivating. I'm not saying that educators don't need to make more money. Don't drop off the call. I'm not saying that. But what I'm saying is that's not necessarily what motivates people. And what he talks about is mastering meaning and purpose, that those are the three things. And that's what the research shows. People having an opportunity to master something, like get really good at it, work on their craft and get good at it. Well, guess what? That's what coaching does, right? It helps people master their craft. It's awesome. Meaning, it means it needs to be relevant to them. So it has to be something in context that they feel like is making a difference for them, and it has, you know, relevance. And then autonomy is another one. And autonomy is all about, you know, kind of running my own show. And I think educators, that's one reason people like to be in education. They like to be in where they can shut the door of their classroom and this is their show. And so making sure we don't interfere with that autonomy when we're coaching, I think is really important. We're supporting that autonomy. A lot of times that's where the relationship doesn't go well, because it's like, you're coming into my space, you know, and, you know, or you're coming into my room, like that feeling of not having as much autonomy can get in the way. I think it's been super cool to see this spring that when we've been coaching virtually, people have maybe even liked it more. It's almost like, okay, I can see you as a coach virtually, but you're not in my space. You know, I'm wondering if that's the psychology of this. So it's just interesting how that works. But those, you know, understanding that research, I think is really important when you're dealing with adults. And those are two, and please, everyone else, feel free to, you know, put in the chat your resources or ideas for things that have helped you to think about, you know, how to work with adults in terms of their learning and motivation. We'd love to see more resources. I mean, you know, I don't have that many books, so I'm always glad to get a few more. That's just one bookshelf, by the way. Lauren, what would you add?
I was just going to note also, I love the comparison you made back to learners as well, because a lot of our best practices and all the work that we do come back to giving students a relevant purpose for their learning and giving them the opportunity to grow and master standards, and just all those pieces come together for what motivates students as well. So I love that connection that you made, for sure. So then why would you say, you know, kind of just starting with why would helping others find their own solutions rather than just telling them the answer, which is easier and faster, why would actually helping them find their own solutions increase their chances of follow through?
So I love that quote, and I think it's on I think I put it at the top of the idea pad. Like, if you tell somebody something, you forever rob them of the opportunity to discover it for themselves. It's really a good quote. There was a quote by Piaget that was about teaching that was similar. And, you know, I saw in the chat, like, you know, what Kelly said, and it's true. It's like, you know, and like what you just said, Lauren, there's so many parallels, right, between what we're talking about with coaching people and what you do with learners in the classroom. But it is true. Once you tell them, they don't get the chance to discover it for themselves. So I think the psychology of that is really important. We have a coach, and I like, she has a quote that when two people leave a conversation, they each leave hearing what they said. So I leave the conversation hearing what I said, and the person that I was coaching leaves the conversation hearing what they said, but they don't leave the conversation necessarily hearing what I said. So if I said all the right answers and they didn't say any of them, then they probably aren't leaving with the information that I would hope that they were leaving with. So there's that. And I mean, y'all know this, but I mean, it feels good to come up with the idea myself, right? Like that makes me feel like, a better professional. I'm working on my own craft. It's something I'm going to do right away because I thought of it, so there's all that psychology behind that. I think that is really, really important. There's a great book called Humble Inquiry by Edgar Schein, and he's like the master of culture. I love him. But Humble Inquiry, it like basically says, hey, look, I don't know the best solutions for you. You know your context better than I do, because I'm not walking in your shoes. Even if I'm in your district, I actually don't know the exact context that you're working within, or that you're, living within, or you're teaching within. So how can I possibly know the right solutions for you? I can't. I'm not you. So the idea of this is together we can figure it out, but you know your context better than anybody. So what's actually going to be actionable. And I've told this story and I put it in our coaching book. Like, when I first was coaching, I got so snowed by, the nodding and smiling and, oh, that's a great idea from the people I was coaching. It's like, oh, I love that idea. Oh, that's a great idea. And then, come back the next time. It's like, how did that work out? Oh, I never tried that. It's like, oh, well, shoot. But so we were having this great conversation. Everybody was happy, I was happy because, I'm so smart because I'm giving them these ideas. They're happy because they're like, conning me and like nodding and smiling and everything's going great. And then we leave and nothing happens. So like, if you are more about results, than you are about having the right answer, then it's about, making sure that the solutions are going to actually be acted on. And that means, that it's coming from them. So I think that, again, especially with systems thinking, knowing the context, actually knowing how it's going to work out, because I'm the one that's living it, is part of that piece. So, and yeah, I love what everyone else is adding to that too. So
you always coach us so well on that too, just as an organization. I love it when you speak to all the brain chemicals that justify why we do everything we do, and how like you're getting happy brain chemicals by coming up with the idea, and you're like robbing your coachee of the opportunity to have their own happy brain chemicals. And I remember when you said that, it just clicked for me, like, I'm robbing them of this opportunity to feel successful and to like own this idea. So that's a good book you gave to us, and always refer to Habits of a Happy Brain.
There it is. Yeah. So thanks for bringing that up, Lauren, because we didn't put that on the idea pad, I don't think, but this book is like, if you are a coach, or by the way, if you are a human being, you want to interact with other people effectively, like it's so great because like Lauren just said, like we're wired, like coming up with a good idea gives us a shot of dopamine. Like literally, it's like addictive, which is why it's so hard as a coach not to have all the ideas, because it feels really good when you do. But again, like Lauren said, when we have all the good ideas, we're robbing that person, so we can get our shot of dopamine just like we did in the classroom when you see students get that aha, right? Like you can get that shot, you can get your happy brain chemicals by other people coming up with ideas, if that's where you can, but it's literally scientific, like Lauren's saying, it's chemical, that we need to let them do that. So yeah, it's good.
Definitely one of the first hurdles of coming out of the classroom, as probably if you were an instructional coach, you were probably an amazing teacher, right? And so coming out of the classroom to then help other teachers be amazing, you want to share what you know. So that can be really challenging first transition into the role of a coach, for sure. So we kind of have talked about why it's valuable, and some resources that you can explore further. I was wondering if you could get a little more specific on just what is helping others discover their own solution. What does that actually sound like?
Okay, yeah, that's great. So, I mean, I think the obvious answer is it sounds like asking questions, right? I mean, that's the beginning of it. And I like to think of it as in the conversation, there's kind of this dance, and it starts with being pretty divergent. In other words, I'm trying to ask questions and open up the conversation early, to ideate ideas. And it doesn't mean I can't have an idea in the conversation as the coach. Definitely doesn't mean that. But I'm trying to ask questions to open up the conversation and get, divergent early. And then I think, and you have to have a feel for this, but at some point it's also a little bit about, so it's asking questions. Oh, by the way, and I think we have a good resource for like question stems that is on the idea pad. So you can look at those question stems that we follow grow as our coaching model. And so those question stems follow that model. I think maybe my favorite question, where is it? Yeah. My favorite question probably, it comes out of this book called The Coaching Habit, which I think may be on there too. And they talk about the awe question, AWE. And I think it's the best question ever in any situation. And it's just, and what else? So somebody answers and you say, oh, wow, cool. And what else? And just that question opens up a lot of other possibilities. So this is true whether you're talking to your spouse, your kid, or an educator that you're coaching. Just don't leave it at that first answer, because that first answer is the quick answer, but it's not necessarily the deep answer. So the first answer is the one that comes to mind right away. The next couple answers are the ones that are probably the best solution. And so asking and what else, and giving them a chance to keep talking rather than jumping in and saying, ooh, I love that idea. This is what I did in my classroom, blah, 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 blah. But go ahead and take it to that next level, and what else will really make a difference. So that's kind of the divergent part of the conversation. I mean, like you said, Lauren, we're all, we're usually in love with our own ideas. So holding back from that and asking the questions, I think is really good. But then there's a point in the conversation where you have to, make it a little bit more convergent. So starting to ask questions about which of these ideas make the most sense in this current context, which of these seem to, be the most actionable at this point. Because the other thing about ideating is, for every person, and again, especially in the current context, there can't be too many things I'm trying to leave this conversation with. Then I'm overwhelmed, right? So helping people discriminate and narrow back down is also really, really important to getting to, what we would call an elegant solution. Like what's the one thing you can do right now kind of thing, instead of the 10 things that I won't do any of. So I think, so divergent, then convergent. And then, it's also some explicit modeling, like, thinking through, I guess, even out loud, my own thinking about how I'm discovering solutions so that it makes it okay in the process, to think like that and to start trying to think through, how I'm problem solving something. So even just, like explicitly modeling that, I think is a part of it as well. But yeah, any of those question stems I think are good just to open up that conversation. Those have been honed over, thousands of conversations. So this isn't just like, oh, this might be a good idea. It's like these questions are working to help people, get to the solutions. And I think those are great. And again, would love to see if anyone has a question that is working really well for them. If you would drop it in the chat and share it with everyone here, I think that would be great. So lots of great coaches on here, and so it'd be awesome to see some of your questions that have been working well for you to help people get to that place.
That awe question is so good. And like you said, for anyone.
It's simple.
So, right. Yes. What was one of the other ones in that book that I love?
He has so many good questions in this book. It's like,
I love the one. I think he says, what's your instinct on that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I love it. Like when people ask you a question and then it's like, well, what's your instinct on that? Because then you're going to get to hear their perspective from their context. And it's just like, and then it's like, and what else? I just love that.
I love that. And I'm glad you bring up, I love what's your instinct on that, because man, people have good instincts. I also like, sometimes you get into a conversation and when you've asked questions, you're opening it up. And sometimes, y'all know this, but people just like to vent. So, and especially again, right now in current context, it's like, when you're opening up the conversation, a lot of times it's like, well, this is what's going wrong. This is what's going wrong. This is, like that kind of thing. I love the question that he has in this book where he says, what's the real challenge here for you? So there's so many things about that question that are good. But one of them is it gets to the heart of, like, what's the key challenge? Let's get to it so we can, think through that. And then also for you, because sometimes, the things people are venting about are things they can't control, or it's about somebody else, or, whatever that comes up in the conversation. And, we want to be empathetic, but that question doesn't cut all that off. It just narrows it down, right? So it's a way to get convergent in terms of what's the real challenge here for you that lets you get to the heart of something you can help coach on, instead of feeling like you got to say, okay, well, let's get back to coaching. You can take that conversation and turn it into what you can coach on. So yeah, great book. Good questions.
That's such a good strategy and a huge takeaway from this interview. I feel like just being able to apply that one thing can really transform certain coaching conversations with certain coachees that you maybe know you've fallen into that spiral with before. We all have them. Mm-hmm. So since we're all coaches and we've probably run into this before, I would like to have Shannon on. What if a coachee thinks they have everything solved and they're great, but possibly from observation or other evidence that this really isn't the case? How would you kind of help them just not only discover their own solutions, but like, what if they don't even see the problem or the challenge?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great question. So far, right, we've been talking about how to help them find their own solutions, but it's like, well, I'm already doing everything, right? And they're, I'm seeing from the nods that people have maybe a few people that they're thinking about in their head. Let's not put those names in the chat, but yeah, this definitely happens, right? So, ooh, I like that question, by the way, that is in the chat. Tell me more about what that would look like. That's a great question too. So what if a coachee thinks they have everything solved? I think it's interesting, right? I like, because of, my psychology background, I like to get to why would someone think that, right? Why would someone approach a coaching conversation like that? And really any situation that I'm encountering with coaching where it's not going exactly, like there's something going on, I'm always like, okay, why is that person feeling that way? I'm trying to like empathize and get myself in their shoes. And I've thought about this, many times before, because, if you've been at this very long, you don't know everything, right? Or like the more you know, the more you realize you can learn, right? So it's like, why would someone feel like they already had it figured out? I think a lot of times they don't necessarily think that. I think they just don't want to change anything. So I think it's more, self-preservation or, protection to feel like, to say, oh yeah, I do that. They don't want to have to leave that conversation with anything they're going to have to fix or change or spend any time on. So I think it's almost self-preservation a lot of times. I think there are some people though, they've had really good results. And, just TBH between us gals, are there guys on here? I think, some of it could be mindset, growth mindset versus fixed mindset. So it's like, if I admit that there's something I don't know, then, that looks bad for me. I think we're changing the culture of education. And I think more and more of us have growth mindset. More and more of us see that it's okay to learn. But if you think about the fact that we've really inherited a compliance culture where it was all about gotcha. If somebody ever came in your room, it was just to see if you were doing something wrong, versus now where we are moving to more of a coaching culture. But for some folks, that takes a little longer. And if you were super good at what you do, you don't want people, you want to be acknowledged for that. So I think giving people the opportunity in that situation, first of all, to be like, yes, you are amazing, you are great, letting them have those good ideas or share those things or whatever. But to get to the heart of how you can, actually coach them, I think it goes back to having standards that you can look at, like clear growth indicators, that when you dig into the growth indicators, like there's no denying, like, yeah, I'm not actually doing that right. It's like the evidence-based conversation and the growth indicators that are super clear and tangible. This isn't personal. That's why we have indicators. It's not about, are you a good teacher or not? Of course you're a good teacher. Like, of course you are. That's not about that. There's always a way to go above and beyond. So with the growth indicators and with the standards, it's not about the person, it's about practice. And I think maybe the silver lining of what's happened recently is everybody is vulnerable and they know it and they're willing for coaching, right? Like people are seeing, like, I mean, like nobody knows everything about this new normal. So people are more open to coaching than ever, I think, right now. And it's okay, right? That's why I think people have always been open to coaching around like technology, because it was okay that you didn't know that part, but to not know instruction, is that okay? No, like I know best practice, right? Of course, I'm an educator, I'm good at this. So I think, that idea of let's go above and beyond, enhancing our craft, explicitly modeling that you're working on things for yourself too, and helping with that growth mindset is a big part of it. But then going back to the standards, if you can't see evidence of something in the standards, it's like, okay, well, then there's an easy place to start for what to work on. So what would you add, Lauren, or anyone else in the chat? Feel free.
Someone mentioned Brene Brown and all her work with vulnerability, which is fabulous. Well, Shannon, you mentioned evidence-based coaching and the standards as a way to help people, a way to like take that pressure off of the coach having to show them that or tell them that something could be improved. I'm just curious what your thoughts are on, or helping clarify even, like, what's the difference between evidence-based coaching and like other types of coaching out there?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, I'm partial. I love evidence-based coaching, which is essentially a performance-based coaching model. I think Buerk put on the idea pad a graphic that kind of shows a continuum. And, I think when we talk about coaching, obviously there's this huge spectrum of what that means to people, everything from casual conversation or just asking questions. There's a whole kind of vein of coaching that is like, I can't give any technical assistance or provide guidance. All I can do is ask questions. And let me be clear, that is not what I'm saying by saying that it's important for people to discover their own solutions. It can get super frustrating if all you're doing is asking questions and you're never actually answering any questions or, providing some technical assistance. So there's a balance to all that. But if you look at that continuum, which comes from super coaching, which, it's this book, it comes from super coaching. It's like this guy talks about that continuum of essentially like telling everybody what to do on one end all the way to, not ever answering a question and just asking questions the whole time. And really evidence-based coaching is somewhere in the middle of that continuum. So it is this constant kind of balancing act, a collaborative act between, providing some guidance and asking questions and kind of, that dance in between those two things. But it's always based on evidence. So a big distinction, and y'all, I just have to say, never more than now has it been clear why evidence-based conversations are so much more effective and efficient than lengthy observation cycles. Going into a room and watching someone, first of all, is not efficient or scalable for us in education, period. And I'm not being critical of any, I'm thankful to people like Jim Knight and others who, made coaching popular. I think it's great. But those models were not designed to work at scale. And they definitely weren't designed to work virtually, because they're dependent on going into a classroom and watching someone do some specific thing and then being able to coach them on that. Well, first of all, it's not very practical if you're a K-12 educator, a coach, to say, I'm going to be able to schedule a time to go in and see this person exactly when they're doing this thing, and that's going to work out in my schedule and theirs. And then I'm going to be able to do that with the 40 other people that I'm coaching and all that's going to work out perfectly. You're never going to get through coaching cycle for every person you coach in a year, or you're only going to coach a few. So it's not efficient at scale. And again, it's not critical. It's just a different model, and it works for a few people, but it doesn't work when you're trying to coach people at scale. And right now we've got to be coaching people at scale. Everybody needs a coach right now. We're trying to do something that is very, very different. So the evidence-based conversation allows you to schedule a session and use evidence in the conversation and make it highly efficient, because all that has to happen is you as a coach and the coachee have to show up and then look at the evidence together. And look can even mean discuss, or, see a picture of, or whatever. You don't have to. So we developed it that way so that it would work at scale in a district and everybody could get coaching. But in the virtual space, it's the only thing that works. It's the only thing that works. Now you can shadow people virtually. We've done that this spring. We've done that before. We shadow our own coaches virtually all the time in a conversation, right? So, yeah, you can do that, but it's not totally necessary, because it's not efficient, and you can coach them through the evidence-based conversation. But it goes back to having standards that you can look at that guide that conversation. So it's not a judgment call. I'm not, as the coach, just, randomly deciding if this is good enough or not. We're using the standards to look at the evidence and have that conversation. So it's not personal. We're looking at it together. Do you think this, I don't know, does it match? Which one does it match? Does it match level 2? Does it match level 3? It seems like it's more like this growth indicator, but you tell me, you're the one that we're implementing it. It's not me evaluating it. It's us assessing it together and getting to that place. And that makes all the difference. That makes all the difference in terms of a place we can go from there. So I think the evidence-based conversation it's super efficient. And then again, it's very effective in getting us to the next level, helping people level up, right? And keep going. So
I've also noticed through the evidence-based coaching, one piece that I especially love is that the teacher is choosing all the evidence that they want to show and have discussed. So it's not like a classroom visit where you walk in and maybe you're going to see 10 or 15 minutes of something, and it's like, oh, if they had just stayed 5 more minutes, they would have seen me do X, Y, Z. Like, that's, frustrating. Whereas when you're bringing evidence to the conversation, it's like, okay, let me represent the things that I did. Here's my evidence. And there's just a lot more ownership to it. It feels like it's something that you're doing, you're a part of it. It's not being done to you. So I really appreciate that side of evidence-based coaching as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I agree. Like, in some ways, that's what Leah's saying too in the chat, is just like, that judgment happens when you walk in the room. No matter how much you try to not be in that space, it still does feel like that. Part of it is the culture we inherited, from that's the way it used to be. You come in to get evaluated. That's what it was. So part of it is that. But yeah, that choice, Lauren, helps to overcome that. Now we're working on something together that you want to work on. So it's good.
So just to go back,
wait, let's go back. I see Tabitha has one about evidence real quick. What if the evidence they bring isn't the standard or goal that they chose to work on? So this is a great question, and really has to do with, as a coach, understanding all your standards well, and your whole timeline well, because if you do, then you can take that evidence and say, oh, well, not like, that's not what we were going to look at, but, that matches this standard. And let's look at those growth indicators, and you can still kind of, give credit, if you will, for what it does match, and then kind of rework. So should we, after that whole conversation, can we go back to, do you want to go back to the goal that you had set last time and think about evidence that might work for that? But even just to back up a little bit, Tabitha, it's like, or everybody, it's like, in the conversation where we set the goals, starting to try to come to agreement on what the evidence might look like in that conversation, because that helps to define that just a little bit before we even leave that conversation. And that'll help too with that idea of, they might bring something that's not exactly in line with it, if that makes sense. But yeah, using that to then just like, as again, a starting point from that conversation, just looking at where they are, matching that up to standards that are already there in growth indicators, and then circling back to the goal that they had set before, if that's where you are on the timeline. So great question. Sorry, Lauren, go ahead.
I know, you're fine. So you had mentioned before that spectrum of basically telling your coachee everything versus only ever asking questions and never sharing anything necessarily. And so I just, as a coach, I would love to hear your perspective on how do you know when to and when not to share maybe a relevant resource or idea? Like, what decision-making process would you use in a conversation?
Okay, awesome. Well, and this is really important because, like I mentioned, you need to share some things. You need to share resources. Like we've had coaches on our team that, on the whole spectrum of, like they'll never answer a question, like only, answer a question with a question. That can get really frustrating for people too. So it's not about that either. I think there's certain critical points in time. So we actually teach our coaches in the first coaching conversation, you want to actually provide a resource that establishes some credibility, gives something to that coachee that they're like, ooh, that was super valuable. Because early in that relationship, you need to establish, I'm here to help you, and here's some idea, here's something that could help you. So that resource early on, I think, is a really, it's important to bring that to the table. I think in the first conversation, it's good not to bombard people with a bunch of ideas, but to think about a good resource that is going to be probably valuable to them and be able to share that with them early on. And that helps establish credibility, relationship, etc. I think the answer going forward from that is it has to be in context. And the only way I know it's going to work in context is if I'm asking enough questions and understand it's kind of a systems thinking approach. I've got to understand what's going to work in context. And I would also say it's got to be really authentic, because like in the moment, like I can't go to a conversation besides the first one. Okay, let's take that one aside. That's why I said it the way I did. After the first conversation, we encourage coaches to have some ideas based on the timeline, but you cannot lead with those resources. If you go in based on the timeline, like we're working on formative feedback today, and I know that's going to be it. And I've got these 3 things and I love these ideas and they work every time and I'm going to share those. If that's the approach to the conversation, that's going to be a fail. But if you go into the conversation prepared, because like these are some good resources, but first you're asking them to share ideas, what's your instinct and what else, some of those questions that we asked. Then in that conversation, it becomes authentic to say, ooh, if it does fit, okay, based on the context that you're sharing, I wonder if this resource would be helpful, right? And then you're pulling that one out. But not leading with it, not saying like, okay, we're working on formative feedback. This will be a great idea for you. That you can't start the conversation that way. So it's got to be authentic, and being able to, in the conversation, be able to contribute to it as you're hearing context that works for that particular resource that you're thinking of. And for sure, that is a part of the coaching conversation. So don't be afraid to provide technical assistance because of the conversation we're having right now. But it's just like not dominating the conversation with that, right? Lauren does a great thing with our coaches where we measure talk time. Like we video ourselves and measure talk time. And, like the coach should not be talking the majority of the time, right? So in that conversation, if you think about it, like I think it probably should be more of a 60-40, 70-30. They're providing 70% of the resources. I'm providing 30%, right? If they haven't shared anything, I can't share anything, right? So it's like getting to that place where they're starting to ideate, then being able to share something, a little bit of a back and forth at least, to make that balance out. If I feel like I'm the one driving the whole thing, I know nothing's going to happen after that. It's just, I'm impressed with myself again, but nothing's really going to happen after I leave. So it's, waiting until I think maybe that first time I can say, ooh, that's a great idea. I love that idea. Like, being able to say that to them first before I'm giving them something is maybe a good way to think about it. And love to hear everybody else's ideas, because it is a balance, for sure.
I will say one way to formatively assess yourself on how that part of the conversation is going is when you get to the end and y'all are thinking about what would evidence look like of this, of what they had committed to. And if your coachee says, wait, what were you saying about that again? Instead of, then that's a good sign that that was your idea. You have no idea what you're talking about, and they're probably not going to do it. Just a good formative assessment. Run into that. So I know we're almost out of time, and we would just love to hear from you, Shannon, just with all of this in mind, the process, the questioning, helping others discover their own solutions, the balance of sharing, in our context of virtual coaching, what considerations, what should we be thinking about moving forward?
Yeah, great question. I mentioned that, surprisingly, we were excited about this, but surprisingly, we found that in some cases, people are really liking virtual better than in person. I think, like I mentioned, because they're in their space and you're in your space as a coach. And so they're not feeling invaded or whatever. They're just feeling like they need. And then I think also, there's a little more desperation and need out there. But in terms of what I want to be doing as a coach, I think, one is thinking about the standards. And of course, we've created best practices for virtual learning. So, you're thinking about it differently in terms of what they need right now. They don't necessarily need all the same things, although best practices do apply, but you want to make sure, you're looking at context and that it makes sense to them and is relevant to context. I think that's one thing that's really important. The other one is just, understanding that there will be some distractions in the virtual space, and how do you mitigate that? We've had to be a little more flexible in terms of scheduling, trying to figure out how to make sure that works well with, the educator, the coachee's schedule. I think it's more important than ever, and this is true for all coaching, but I think it's more important than ever to have a standing meeting. So it's like, we're not trying to schedule this as, I think we can have a tendency in the virtual situation to become those, put out the fire coaches that are responding to crisis. And while it's important to be responsive for sure, we cannot give up proactive coaching. Proactive coaching needs to be taking place in the virtual space. And so scheduling out conversations with people, even if that means you have to reschedule and things like that, but scheduling out conversations in advance so that there is something I know I can see on my calendar, this is coming up. Like, I know I'm going to get help at this time. It's an emotional support as well as a practical support for people. But using time as a coach, and if you're a leader in a district that's thinking about it from a scheduling standpoint, just if people are just doing this as responsive, only people that are reaching out, are going to get the help. And everybody needs a coach right now, everybody. So especially when, the other thing that's happening, of course, is some people are having to give up their coaching positions because of possible, or limit some of their coaching positions, or they think that IT, just on the technology, is the only coaching they need. And that is not true. As we go into this next year, it can't just be about, how do I get you on the platform? How do you use the technology? It cannot just be about that. We can't lose a year while all we're doing is just managing the technology. It has to be about best practices in the virtual space and ensuring that we're getting student achievement, mitigating the learning loss of this last 9 weeks, making sure that we're engaging kids and we're creating equity. I mean, all the stuff that, good instructional practice does, but it's got to be, in that virtual context. So we'll be virtual again this next year. I talked about the 4 futures, and one of them is definitely virtual. We're going to be virtual again. So scheduling that stuff out for the year, and then saying, even if we go virtual, we don't have to revamp everything. It's already in place. You already know you're going to get your coaching touches. I think that reassurance for people right now is huge. So taking that time to schedule that out, make sure everybody has a go-to. Every person has a go-to at a coach that I'm going to see you on this date, just like I always do. Right? That's how that's going to work. I think that's really, really important in this time. It's an anchor that I can hold on to. So I commend all of you for all the work that you're doing and supporting educators through this change. It's more critical than ever because people feel more vulnerable than ever and need more help than ever. So, and I know that everyone else is, everyone on here is exhausted and, just barely holding it together too. So then trying to support other people is another layer. But as leaders, it's just so critical. So thanks for all you're doing to make that happen during this really critical time.
And thank you, Shannon, so much for giving us the opportunity to learn from you. You are the master. We would love to hear from y'all. So if you would, on your way out, please add any additional need to knows, but also if you would share an aha that you had during this session that you're going to incorporate into your practice, if you would share that in the chat as your exit ticket, we would just love to hear from you there. I mean, I feel like I could put in 10 new things every time I hear Shannon talk about this work. It's so informative, it's so valuable, especially making our plans for moving forward. So thanks again, Shannon, for being willing to answer all of our questions.
Well, thank you. The worst thing about this session is I couldn't hear from each one of you. So I would love to hear all of your insights. So it would be helpful to see what resonated with you or a new idea in the chat. So thanks, Lauren, for facilitating. Great questions.